Genre Part 2. Character Alignment and Conflict. State Standard HS4.T.CN2.A. Integrate conventions and knowledge from different art forms and other disciplines to develop a cross-cultural theatrical work. Conflict is defined as a struggle between opposing forces. Odds are really good that by the time you're a senior in high school, you've had to study the different kinds of conflict multiple times in your English class. And there's a reason for that. Conflict is what makes a story interesting. We are human beings. We like the drama. We like to watch people butt heads. We like to watch someone struggle against the odds. It makes for good story. What we don't often think about is that ratios of character alignment can determine the kind of conflict that is available to a given story. So, for example, if your characters are mostly good aligned, whether they're lawful or chaotic, they're mostly good aligned, meaning they are mostly looking out for each other or for other people, then your opposition, the thing that creates the conflict, needs to be something without a conscience. So most of the time, when you have a story where most of the characters are good aligned, your conflict will be man versus nature. This is a story about the human struggle to survive despite the forces of nature, because nature has no conscience and is relentless. Nature is neither good nor evil. It cannot be good or evil because it has no conscience. It just is. If you've read a story or seen a movie where the main character must face some sort of storm or event that happens as a force of nature, such as an animal attack, you've seen the man versus nature conflict in action. Natural disasters like tornadoes or a character who's lost at sea and trying to find land are examples of this conflict as well. In these stories, the concept of human survival despite the forces of nature is highlighted, and in many cases, you'll also find the internal conflict of man versus self playing out simultaneously. A large reason for this is that nature can be significantly more powerful than humanity, so there is much self-doubt and struggle as the protagonist comes to terms with this fact. When you have a story where characters are mostly neutral aligned on the good versus evil axis, meaning sometimes they're looking out for each other, sometimes they're self-interested, the conflict will come from the other characters. It comes specifically from opposing goals among characters. One character, character A, wants something, character B wants something else. Those things create the conflict because they both cannot achieve their goals. This kind of conflict is called man versus man, or person versus person. This is conflict with another individual. Man versus man is commonly seen in literature and modern storytelling and is a type of external conflict. This conflict will most often play out between a protagonist and his or her antagonist, although it can also appear between friends or acquaintances. Often you will see that friends and acquaintances man versus man conflict as a subplot. When characters are mostly evil aligned, then the conflict will often come from within themselves as they struggle with their selfishness and morality. This kind of conflict is called man versus self. Officially, the definition is that a character's internal conflict results from a clash between desires and morals, ethics, or values. Man versus self is the only example of internal conflict you'll see in literary works and involves a character experiencing conflict within his or her own mind. Man versus self conflict is most often seen when a character faces mixed emotions over his or her actions, or over a decision that has to be made or has been made. You can also see this conflict evident when a character is facing mental illness or is unable to forgive him or herself over past actions. When characters are mostly lawfully aligned, meaning they mostly believe in the rules and want to uphold the rules, whether or not they are good or evil. The conflict, then, must come from social norms that conflict with those rules. This is when you get man versus society as your conflict. Man versus society is defined as a personal struggle against popular expectations. This type of conflict is often seen in science fiction and is an external conflict that involves a protagonist at odds with a ruling body, which could be one's own family or social or cultural norms. For example, if the protagonist is fighting his or her government or is accused of a crime that he or she didn't commit, these would be examples of man versus society as a conflict. If a protagonist is going against the grain of what his or her society and people expect, this is also an example of man versus society conflict. When characters are mostly neutrally aligned on the lawful versus chaotic axis, regardless of good versus evil, then the conflict cannot come from opposing goals, so it must come from something that has no goals. This is when you're going to get your man versus machine conflict. In other words, you're going to get a story about humanity or the soul or the conscience versus something that lacks a soul or a conscience. This is a more contemporary type of conflict, and the situation results from humans involved in a struggle with man-made machines. This is also an external conflict. When characters are mostly chaotically aligned on the lawful chaotic axis, meaning they do not care for the rules of society at all, then the conflict has to come from a higher power attempting to impose an ultimate authority that cannot be negotiated with. This is when you're going to get a man versus fate conflict. Another way to look at this is free will versus a supernatural influence, something like the Oedipus Rex story, for example. In Man versus Fate, or Man versus the Supernatural, as it is sometimes called, this is a conflict that occurs when the protagonist finds him or herself pitted against a vengeful god or powerful supernatural force. As with other types of character conflict, particularly man versus nature, you'll often see this when combined with man versus self. This is because the protagonist must come to terms with his or her own humanity and limitations when involved in a man versus fate conflict. When you get a situation where you have an even split of character alignments, you have roughly the same number of characters aligned in each quadrant, you're going to result in a hero's journey. In a hero's journey, you get a little bit of all kinds of conflict rolled together, as opposed to just one or two. In a hero's journey, your hero, your protagonist, leaves home and encounters new people, battles the elements, and faces off against ultimate evil in order to achieve a goal. The hero's journey is a classic story structure that's shared by stories worldwide. The term was coined by the academic Joseph Campbell in 1949 and refers to a wide-ranging category of tales in which a character ventures out to get what they need, faces conflict, and ultimately triumphs over adversity.